The radio crackled with static, then silence. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reaper Kowalski pressed his earpiece harder against his head, as if force could somehow resurrect the dead channel. Around him, 8 Navy SEALs crouched behind the crumbling concrete barrier of what had once been a school playground in the dusty outskirts of Kandahar province. The Taliban had turned it into something else entirely. Overwatch, this is Trident 6. Radio check over. Nothing. Just the metallic hiss of empty frequencies and the distant crack of rifle fire echoing off the surrounding hills. Kowalski's jaw tightened as he watched his men exchange glances, the kind of looks that said everything without words. They'd been fighting for 6 hours straight, and their extraction window was closing fast. The mission had started clean. Intelligence suggested a high-value target was holed up in the compound ahead, a bomb maker responsible for 3 IED attacks that had killed 12 American soldiers in the past month. Simple snatch and grab. Get in, neutralize the threat, get out. But intelligence, as every operator knew, was often just educated guessing dressed up in confident briefings. What they'd found instead was a hornet's nest. At least 40 Taliban fighters, dug in deep with mortars, heavy machine guns, and what sounded like a recoilless rifle that had already put 2 craters in the ground uncomfortably close to their position. The safe house was actually a fortified weapons cache, and word of their presence had spread through the valley like wildfire. "Sir, we've got movement on the North Ridge," whispered Petty Officer Rodriguez, his scope tracking shadows between the rocks. "Looks like they're trying to flank us." Kowalski studied his map, calculating distances and angles with the methodical precision that had kept him alive through 4 combat deployments. Without air support, they were effectively trapped. The extraction point was 3 clicks south, but the terrain between here and there was a killing field, open ground with no cover, perfectly positioned for an ambush. The original plan had called for an A-10 Warthog to provide close air support during their egress, that distinctive titanium bathtub flying low and slow, its GAU-8 cannon turning enemy positions into memory. But 15 minutes ago, the pilot had reported a mechanical malfunction and was returning to base. Since then, radio contact with their tactical operations center had been sporadic at best. Now they were alone in the growing darkness, with Taliban fighters closing in from 3 sides and nowhere to run. The kind of situation that separated the living from the legends, where split-second decisions meant the difference between coming home or becoming another name carved into black granite in Washington. What none of them knew was that their salvation was already airborne, flying through the thin mountain air at 200 feet above ground level, guided by nothing but stubborn determination, and a promise made long ago in a different war, in a different life, by a pilot whose call sign carried ghosts. The rescue was coming. It just wasn't coming from where they expected. Staff Sergeant Valentina Ghost Kozlova pulled back on the stick of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, feeling the familiar resistance as the aircraft climbed through 8,000 feet. The Warthog wasn't pretty. Everyone said so. With its straight wings, twin engines mounted high on the fuselage, and that unmistakable snub nose housing the 7-barrel GAU-8 cannon, it looked like something designed by committee to be as ugly as possible. But Valentina had learned long ago that beautiful things rarely survived contact with reality. The maintenance chief at Bagram Airfield had been clear. Hydraulic pressure was dropping in the primary flight control system. Standard procedure dictated an immediate return to base, full stop. No exceptions. But as Valentina monitored her instruments, watching the needle hover just above the red line, she heard something that changed everything. Any station, this is Trident 6. We are taking heavy fire and need immediate close air support. I say again, we need CAS now." The transmission cut through the radio chatter like a blade. Valentina recognized the voice. She'd provided support for SEAL teams before. There was something in the tone, a controlled desperation that spoke of men running out of options and time. She glanced at her fuel gauge, did quick calculations in her head, then made a decision that would have sent her flight commander into apoplexy. Instead of turning southeast toward Bagram, she banked north toward the Kandahar Valley. Valentina's hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced efficiency, checking weapons systems and running diagnostics. The A-10 carried a full combat load, 250 rounds of 30-depleted uranium ammunition for the GAU-8, 6 AGM-65 Maverick missiles, and 4 500-pound Mark 82 general-purpose bombs. Enough firepower to level a city block, if needed. The radio erupted again. Trident 6 is taking fire from 3 sides. We've got approximately 40 enemy fighters in hardened positions. Request immediate air support. Grid coordinates follow. Valentina copied the grid reference, cross-checking it against her navigation system. 12 minutes out at current speed. She pushed the throttles forward, feeling the twin General Electric TF-34 engines respond with a deep, reassuring rumble. The hydraulic warning light flickered amber, but the pressure held steady. For now. Below her, the Afghan landscape unfolded in familiar patterns of brown and tan, carved by ancient rivers and marked by the scars of modern warfare. She'd flown this route dozens of times, supporting ground operations across Helmand and Kandahar provinces. Each mission was different, but they all shared the same fundamental truth. Somewhere down there, Americans were fighting for their lives, trusting that their guardian angels wore wings. What made this mission different wasn't the mechanical problems or the late evening timing. It was the silence from her own command structure. No clearance, no oversight, no backup. Just her, an aging attack aircraft with questionable hydraulics, and 8 SEALs who needed help. In the military, they called it going off the reservation. In Valentina's mind, she called it keeping a promise made to herself after her first combat deployment, when she'd watched a helicopter go down because air support arrived 30 seconds too late. Some promises, she'd learned, were worth breaking protocol to keep. The terrain below began to roughen as Valentina approached the target area, rocky hills and deep wadis that provided perfect hiding places for insurgent fighters. She activated her targeting pod, the infrared camera painting the world in shades of white and gray. Through the scope, she could see muzzle flashes twinkling like deadly stars in the gathering dusk. Trident 6, this is Hog 27. I'm 5 mics out with a full combat load. What's your situation? The response came back immediately, relief evident even through the static. Hog 27, Trident 6. We are combat effective but pinned down. Approximately 40 enemy fighters in prepared positions. We've got wounded and need emergency extraction. Valentina studied the infrared display, identifying the SEAL position by their infrared strobes and mapping the enemy firing positions. The Taliban had chosen their ground well, overlapping fields of fire, natural cover, and elevated positions that made a frontal assault suicide. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd never faced an A-10 Warthog flown by someone who understood that sometimes the most dangerous person in the sky is the one with nothing left to lose. Copy that, Trident 6. I'm beginning my attack run now. Keep your heads down and mark your position with IR strobes. This is going to be loud. She rolled the aircraft into a shallow dive, lining up on the northernmost enemy position. The GAU-8 cannon was already spinning up, its 7 barrels rotating with mechanical precision. In 30 seconds, the Taliban fighters below would learn why American soldiers called the A-10 the Hand of God. But first, Valentina had to solve a problem that was becoming increasingly urgent. Her hydraulic pressure had just dropped another 5 psi, and the amber warning light was flickering more frequently. Flying a damaged aircraft into combat was risky enough. Flying one that might lose flight controls at any moment bordered on insane. She thought about her younger brother, Dmitri, killed in a roadside bombing during his second tour in Iraq. She thought about the promise she'd made at his funeral, standing in Arlington Cemetery while rain drummed against her dress blue uniform. Most of all, she thought about the 8 men below who were counting on her to bring them home. The hydraulic warning light could flicker all it wanted. Tonight, she had work to do. The first pass was textbook. Valentina lined up her attack run from the northeast, diving at a 30-degree angle that gave her the optimal balance between accuracy and survivability. The GAU-8 cannon erupted to life with its distinctive BRRRT sound, a noise that had become legend among ground troops. Depleted uranium rounds streamed downward at 4,200 rounds per minute, each one capable of punching through tank armor. The hillside erupted in clouds of dust and debris as the cannon fire walked across the Taliban positions. Through her targeting pod, Valentina watched insurgent fighters scramble for deeper cover, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into chaos. But she wasn't done. Banking hard left, she set up for a second pass, this time targeting the mortar position that had been dropping rounds dangerously close to the SEAL team. Trident 6 Hog 27, how's that looking down there? Outstanding shooting, Hog. You've got them rattled. We're seeing multiple enemy KIA and the survivors are withdrawing to the south. Valentina smiled grimly as she circled for another attack run. The A-10 wasn't fast or pretty, but it was precise. Every round fired was aimed with surgical accuracy, minimizing collateral damage while maximizing impact on legitimate military targets. This wasn't carpet bombing or area denial. This was personal. The hydraulic system chose that moment to remind her of its existence. The pressure dropped another 10 psi, and she felt a subtle change in the aircraft's handling characteristics. The control surfaces were still responding, but there was a sluggishness that hadn't been there before. She had maybe 20 minutes of flight time left before the system failed completely. Trident 6, what's your extraction status? I may not be able to stay on station much longer. Working on it, Hog. Our ride's been delayed. Can you give us another 20 mics? Valentina looked at her instruments again. Hydraulic pressure was now in the red zone, and she could feel the aircraft becoming increasingly difficult to control. By all rights, she should be heading back to base immediately, but below her, 8 American warriors were counting on her protection while they waited for extraction. Roger that, Trident 6. I'll stay until you're clear. It was a promise she intended to keep, even if it killed her. Because sometimes the difference between a good pilot and a great one wasn't skill or training, it was knowing when to break the rules. The Taliban, apparently unaware that their situation had gone from bad to worse, began regrouping for another assault. The second attack run was more complex. Intelligence, what little they had, suggested the Taliban fighters were using a network of caves and tunnels carved into the hillside. Taking them out would require precision strikes with the Maverick missiles, each one guided by laser designation to its target. Valentina selected the first missile, locked onto the largest cave entrance and fired. The AGM-65 Maverick streaked downward trailing white smoke, its 125-pound warhead impacting with surgical precision. The cave mouth disappeared in a flash of orange flame and falling rock. She immediately locked onto a second target, a machine gun position that had been providing suppressing fire, and sent another Maverick into the fight. Good hits, Hog. You're breaking their backbone down here. But the Taliban weren't finished. As Valentina climbed for altitude, she caught movement on her targeting display. Vehicle headlights moving fast from the west. Reinforcements. 3 pickup trucks, probably carrying additional fighters and heavy weapons. If they reached the fighting positions, the SEALs would be outnumbered 3-1. The hydraulic warning alarm was now a constant presence in her headset, but Valentina pushed it aside and focused on the tactical picture. The trucks were moving in convoy formation along a dirt road that snaked through the valley floor. One well-placed bomb could take out all 3, but it would require a diving attack that would stress her already compromised flight controls. She made the calculation in seconds, Risk versus reward. 8 American lives versus 1 experimental aircraft and its stubborn pilot. The math was simple. Trident 6, I've got 3 vehicles inbound from the west. I'm going to interdict. Roger Hogg, we see them too. They're moving fast. Valentina rolled into a steep dive, pushing the A-10 toward its structural limits. The airframe groaned under the stress, and she could feel the hydraulic system struggling to maintain control authority. At 4,000 feet, she pickled off a Mark 82 bomb, watching as it arced toward the lead vehicle. The explosion lit up the night like a miniature sun. When the smoke cleared, all 3 trucks had vanished, replaced by a crater and scattered debris. The reinforcements that might have turned the tide were now just burning metal and bitter memories. But victory came with a price. As Valentina pulled out of her dive, the hydraulic system finally gave up. The pressure gauge dropped to 0, and the aircraft immediately became sluggish and unresponsive. She was now flying a 10-ton glider with the aerodynamic properties of a brick. Trident 6, Hog 27. I've lost primary hydraulics. I can stay on station, but my maneuvering capability is severely limited. Copy that, Hog. Our extraction bird is 15 minutes out. Can you hold until then? Valentina looked at her instruments. No hydraulics meant no powered flight controls. Every input would be manual, requiring physical strength to move the control surfaces against the airstream. She could maintain level flight, maybe execute gentle turns, but any aggressive maneuvering was now impossible. Affirmative, Trident 6. I'll keep the bad guys honest until your ride shows up. What she didn't tell them was that landing would now be a proposition somewhere between extremely dangerous and outright suicidal. The extraction helicopter, a U-60 Black Hawk, appeared as a dot on the horizon exactly 15 minutes later, its rotors beating a steady rhythm against the night air. Valentina watched through her targeting pod as the aircraft flared for landing in a small clearing 600 meters from the SEAL position. But the Taliban had been watching too. Muzzle flashes erupted from positions that had remained hidden during the earlier engagement. Tracer rounds reached up toward the helicopter like deadly fireworks, and Valentina could see the pilot executing evasive maneuvers as he fought to reach the landing zone. Hog 27, this is Dustoff 36. I'm taking fire from multiple positions. Can you suppress? Without hydraulics, Valentina couldn't execute the kind of precision diving attacks that had cleared the earlier positions. But she still had one weapon that didn't require fancy maneuvering, the GAU-8 cannon. She lined up as best she could and let the Avenger speak. The 7-barrel cannon roared to life, sending a stream of 30 rounds into the hillside. Even from level flight, the impact was devastating. Whole sections of rock face simply vanished under the onslaught, and the enemy fire began to slacken immediately. That's effective fire, Hog. I'm going in. The Black Hawk touched down in a cloud of dust and flying debris. Valentina watched through her infrared scope as 8 figures sprinted from cover toward the waiting aircraft, carrying their wounded and leaving nothing behind but empty brass and fading heat signatures. 30 seconds later, the helicopter was airborne again, climbing rapidly away from the valley floor with its precious cargo of American warriors. Trident 6 is clear and secure. Hog 27, you saved our lives tonight. Valentina allowed herself a small smile as she watched the Black Hawk disappear into the darkness. Mission accomplished. 8 men going home to their families instead of coming home in flag-draped boxes. But now came the hard part, getting herself back to base with an aircraft that was becoming more unflyable with each passing minute. The flight back to Bagram was a masterclass in aviation crisis management. Without hydraulic assistance, every control input required physical strength that left Valentina's arms aching and her flight suit soaked with sweat. The A-10 wanted to drop its nose and dive toward the earth, fought her on every turn, and responded to throttle inputs with all the grace of a wounded elephant. But she'd trained for this. Hours in the simulator, practicing emergency procedures until they became instinct. Manual reversion flight, engine-out approaches, combat damage scenarios that pushed both pilot and aircraft to their absolute limits. The training was paying off now, each muscle memory helping her coax the crippled warthog through the night sky. Bagram Tower, Hog 27 requesting priority handling. I've lost primary hydraulic pressure and am executing manual reversion flight. Hog 27, Bagram Tower. Roger your emergency. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Wind is calm, visibility unlimited. You're cleared for straighten approach runway 21. The runway lights appeared in the distance like a string of jewels against the black Afghan landscape. Valentina had never seen anything more beautiful, but getting to them would require executing a landing with an aircraft that now handled like a freight train with square wheels. She configured for landing as best she could. Gear down, flaps to landing position, airspeed carefully managed to avoid either stalling or coming in too fast. The manual warned that landing without hydraulics was possible but not recommended. Tonight, recommendations were a luxury she couldn't afford. The approach was stable until the last 500 feet, when a crosswind gust caught the aircraft and pushed it toward the right edge of the runway. Without hydraulic boost, Valentina had to use every ounce of strength to force the rudder pedals and bring the nose back to centerline. Her legs burned with the effort, but she held the heading. The main gear touched down with a jarring impact that rattled her teeth. Without hydraulic pressure in the wheel brakes, stopping would be entirely up to aerodynamic drag and whatever manual brake pressure she could generate. The runway streaked past at what felt like highway speeds, yellow centerline lights flashing by in a hypnotic rhythm. Finally, blessedly, the aircraft rolled to a stop just past the 3,000-foot marker. Valentina sat in the cockpit for a long moment, hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to fade. Around her, the A-10 systems wound down with mechanical sighs and clicks. She'd made it. 8 SEALs were alive and she was alive. In the grand scheme of military operations, it was a small victory, a footnote in someone else's war story. But small victories, she'd learned, were sometimes the ones that mattered most. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft, their red and blue lights painting the tarmac in patriotic colors. As Valentina climbed down from the cockpit, she was met by her crew chief, Master Sergeant Peterson, whose worried expression transformed into a grin when he saw her walking upright. "Jesus, Ghost, when we heard you'd lost hydraulics, we thought," he shook his head. "How the hell did you get her down in one piece?" Valentina pulled off her helmet and ran a hand through sweat-dampened hair. "She's tougher than she looks, Pete, just like the rest of us." But as she walked toward the debriefing room, she knew that tonight had been different. Not just another combat mission, but something that would ripple outward in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Because in 12 hours, when the mission reports were filed and the after-action reviews began, someone would ask a very simple question. Why did Staff Sergeant Kozlova disobey direct orders to return to base? And the answer to that question would change everything. The debriefing room smelled of bad coffee and bureaucratic tension. Valentina sat across from Lieutenant Colonel James Hammer Morrison, her squadron commander, while a court reporter's fingers danced across a stenotype machine. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with electronic persistence, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look tired and older than their years. Morrison was reading from a thick folder, his expression unreadable. "Staff Sergeant Kozlova, according to your maintenance log, you experienced primary hydraulic system failure at approximately 21:30 hours. Standard operating procedure clearly states that any aircraft experiencing this malfunction should return immediately to base. Instead, you proceeded to provide close air support to ground forces for an additional 43 minutes. Explain." Valentina kept her voice steady, professional. "Sir, I heard a call for immediate close air support from troops in contact. My aircraft was still flyable, and I assessed that the tactical situation required immediate intervention. Your aircraft was not flyable according to technical specifications. You violated direct maintenance directives and endangered both yourself and a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Morrison leaned back in his chair. What you did was reckless, Sergeant. Explain to me why I shouldn't recommend you for court-martial. The question hung in the air like smoke from a crashed aircraft. Valentina had known this moment would come, had known it the instant she'd banked north instead of south. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely. Sir, 8 Navy SEALs are alive today because of that decision. I understand the regulations, but sometimes regulations and reality don't align. Regulations exist for a reason, Sergeant. They're written in blood and designed to prevent exactly the kind of cowboy heroics you displayed tonight. Morrison's voice carried the weariness of a career officer who'd seen too many good pilots make bad decisions. You could have been killed. Worse, you could have crashed into friendly forces. But I didn't, sir. The mission was successful. This time, Morrison closed the folder and leaned forward. Valentina, you're one of the best pilots in this squadron. Your combat record speaks for itself. But tonight, you crossed a line that I can't ignore. The room fell silent except for the steady clicking of the court reporter's machine. Valentina understood the impossible position her commander faced. Discipline had to be maintained, even when, especially when, the violation had saved American lives. The military ran on rules and order, not individual judgment calls, no matter how well-intentioned. Sir, I'd like to make a statement for the record. Morrison nodded. Go ahead. My brother, Staff Sergeant Dmitry Kozlov, was killed by an IED in Fallujah in 2006. He died because air support was delayed by mechanical issues and bureaucratic caution. I swore at his funeral that I would never let procedure stand in the way of bringing American warriors home alive. Tonight, I kept that promise. The silence stretched longer this time. Morrison's expression softened slightly, though his official posture remained unchanged. Your personal motivations are understandable, Sergeant, but they don't supersede military law and regulation. I'm recommending you for a formal reprimand and temporary grounding pending a full investigation. Valentina nodded. She'd expected as much. Understood, sir. However, Morrison continued, I'm also recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. What you did tonight was stupid, dangerous, and completely against protocol. It was also magnificent. As Valentina walked out of the debriefing room, she wondered if the price had been worth it. Her flying career was probably over, at least temporarily. But somewhere in America, 8 families would be getting phone calls with good news instead of visits from chaplains. Sometimes that was enough. The investigation that followed was thorough, predictable, and ultimately pointless. Military bureaucracy ground through its established processes with mechanical precision, interviewing witnesses, reviewing technical data, and generating enough paperwork to deforest a small nation. Valentina spent her days in administrative limbo, grounded and assigned to paperwork duties that felt like punishment disguised as procedure. But while the Air Force worked through its official response, word of the mission had begun spreading through unofficial channels. The 8 SEALs Valentina had saved weren't bound by military protocol when it came to telling their story. In bars and mess halls across Afghanistan, they spoke of the pilot who disobeyed orders to save their lives, who'd landed a crippled aircraft after refusing to abandon them. Military communities are small, insular worlds where reputation travels faster than official communications. Within a week, everyone at Bagram knew about Ghost, Kozlova, and her hydraulic-less landing. The story grew in the telling, as military stories always do, but the core remained unchanged. A pilot had risked everything to bring American soldiers home. The first sign that something was changing came during a routine supply flight to forward operating base Shank. Valentina was riding as a passenger, still grounded pending the investigation's completion, when the loadmaster approached her with an unusual request. "Ma'am, we've got some rangers on board who wanted to meet you. They heard about what you did for those SEALs." The rangers were young, maybe 22 or 23, with the lean builds and thousand-yard stares that came from extended combat operations. They approached with the awkward formality of soldiers meeting someone they considered legendary. "Ma'am, we just wanted to say thank you," the senior ranger said, "for what you did, for showing them that we don't leave people behind." Valentina was surprised by the emotional weight of the encounter. These weren't her unit or her responsibility, but they clearly felt a connection to her actions that transcended organizational boundaries. In their eyes, she saw something she'd never expected, respect that bordered on reverence. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "We're all on the same team." "Yes, ma'am, but some people remember what team they're on even when it's hard." The encounter left Valentina unsettled in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She'd made a tactical decision based on immediate circumstances, not some grand gesture of military virtue. But clearly, others saw something different in her actions, something larger and more significant than a simple violation of maintenance protocols. When she returned to Bagram, she found her locker decorated with unit patches from dozens of ground units she'd never heard of. Rangers, special forces, regular infantry, even some Marine units that had somehow gotten word of the story. Each patch represented a group of warriors who decided that what she'd done mattered. The official investigation concluded 3 weeks later with a verdict that satisfied no one and disappointed everyone. The final report was a masterpiece of military doublespeak, simultaneously condemning and praising Valentina's actions while carefully avoiding any definitive judgment that might establish precedent. She received both a formal reprimand for violating maintenance directives and a commendation for exceptional performance under combat conditions. The punishment was minimal, 30 days of additional duty and a letter in her permanent file. The commendation carried no medal or formal recognition, just bureaucratic language that acknowledged her quick thinking and decisive action in support of ground operations. It was the kind of compromise that allowed everyone involved to claim victory while changing absolutely nothing. But the real judgment had already been rendered in mess halls and ready rooms across the theater of operations. Among the people who mattered, the pilots, crew chiefs, and ground troops who understood what combat actually looked like, Valentina had already been tried and acquitted by unanimous verdict. Her return to flight status was announced without fanfare on a Tuesday morning in October. The squadron operations officer simply posted her name on the next day's flight schedule, as if nothing had happened. But when Valentina walked into the ready room for her first briefing in a month, she found something unexpected: complete silence. Every pilot in the room was standing at attention. It wasn't regulation. There was no requirement for such a display. But as Valentina looked around the room at her fellow aviators, men and women who'd flown hundreds of combat missions, who'd seen friends die and enemies triumph, she understood that something fundamental had changed. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand. "Welcome back, Ghost. Ready to get back to work?" "Yes, sir, always ready." But as she took her seat for the mission briefing, Valentina realized that work would never feel quite the same. The weight of 8 lives saved had somehow transformed into the weight of expectations from hundreds of others who now saw her not just as a pilot, but as a symbol of something larger. The story of Ghost Kozlova was just beginning, and like all the best military legends, it would be written not in official records, but in the memories of warriors who understood that sometimes doing the right thing meant breaking the rules. Over the next 6 months, Valentina flew 63 more combat missions, each one executed with the same methodical precision that had characterized her entire career. But now there was something different in how other units requested air support, a subtle deference that suggested her reputation had preceded her. Ground commanders who'd never met her specifically asked for Ghost by call sign. Her radio transmissions were answered with a respect that bordered on reverence. And in the peculiar mathematics of military culture, where reputation was currency and trust was the most valuable commodity, Valentina found herself wealthy beyond measure. The transformation wasn't immediate or obvious. Military culture changed slowly, like geological processes that operated on timescales measured in deployments rather than days. But gradually, inevitably, the story of the pilot who disobeyed orders to save 8 SEALs became part of the larger narrative of American military operations in Afghanistan. It started with small things. Maintenance crews who worked extra hours to ensure her aircraft was in perfect condition. Intelligence officers who provided more detailed briefings when she was assigned to missions. Ground troops who transmitted their coordinates with unusual precision when they knew Ghost was providing air support. But the most significant change was in how other pilots approached their missions. The unspoken understanding that sometimes, just sometimes, regulations were suggestions rather than absolute commands, that the judgment of experienced combat pilots might occasionally supersede the wisdom of staff officers who'd never been shot at. Lieutenant Morrison began noticing it during squadron briefings, questions that hadn't been asked before. What if we encounter troops in contact outside our assigned sector? At what point does immediate tactical necessity override standing operational orders? How do we balance mission parameters with emerging opportunities? The questions weren't explicitly about Valentina's actions, but they might as well have been. Her decision had planted seeds of doubt about the absolute nature of military authority, and those seeds were beginning to sprout in the minds of younger pilots who'd grown up believing that following orders was the highest virtue. Morrison found himself in the uncomfortable position of defending regulations he'd never questioned while simultaneously understanding why his pilots were questioning them. The military needed order and discipline to function effectively, but it also needed warriors capable of independent thought when circumstances demanded flexibility. Valentina, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the philosophical chaos she'd inadvertently unleashed. She flew her missions with the same quiet competence she'd always displayed, provided air support with surgical precision, and returned to base without fanfare or self-promotion. If anything, she seemed more focused than before, as if the weight of her growing reputation had crystallized her sense of purpose. It was during a particularly challenging mission in Helmand Province that the full implications of her legend became clear. The call came at 300 hours on a moonless February night. A Marine reconnaissance team had been compromised during a surveillance mission and was surrounded by Taliban fighters in the rugged terrain near Sangin. Multiple attempts to reach them with ground forces had failed, and the Marines were running low on ammunition. Valentina was assigned as primary close air support, with Captain Jake Viper Rodriguez as her wingman. As they approached the target area, the tactical picture painted itself across their displays in infrared signatures and radio transmissions that told a story of American warriors fighting for their lives. Overwatch, this is Recon 24. We are surrounded and taking heavy casualties. Request immediate air support. The Marine position was in a small compound surrounded by hills that provided perfect cover for attacking forces. Getting close enough for effective gun runs would require flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire from multiple positions. Standard tactical doctrine called for standoff missile attacks to suppress enemy air defenses before moving to close-range engagement. But standard tactical doctrine hadn't written the rules for this particular fight. Recon 24, this is Ghost. I'm beginning my attack run now. What happened next would be discussed in tactical aviation courses for years to come. Instead of following established protocols, Valentina executed a series of attacks that seemed to defy both physics and common sense. Flying at deck level through valleys that were barely wider than her wingspan, using terrain masking to approach enemy positions from unexpected angles, appearing and disappearing like the call sign that had given her fame. Each attack run was perfectly timed and executed with surgical precision. Enemy positions that had been firing down on the Marines were systematically eliminated, their operators never seeing the A-10 until 30 rounds were already impacting their positions. It was flying that bordered on supernatural, as if Valentina had somehow bonded with her aircraft in ways that transcended normal pilot-machine relationships. Captain Rodriguez, flying as her wingman, would later describe it as watching someone rewrite the textbook in real time. By dawn, 12 Marines were extracted safely from what should have been their final fighting position. The Taliban force that had surrounded them was scattered to the winds, their carefully planned ambush turned into a rout by a pilot who seemed to understand something about combat flying that others had missed. The after-action report would be classified and filed away in databases that few would ever access. But the story would live on in the memories of 12 Marines who'd been hours away from becoming casualties, and in the growing legend of a pilot who'd learned to make impossible things look routine. Word of the Helmand mission spread through the military community with the speed and inevitability of wildfire. In the digital age, combat stories traveled along fiber optic cables and satellite links, shared through encrypted channels, and whispered in ready rooms across the theater of operations. But this story carried something extra, a resonance that elevated it beyond typical war narratives. Perhaps it was the impossible flying, or the systematic dismantling of a superior enemy force, or simply the accumulating weight of a pilot who seemed to specialize in rescuing American warriors from impossible situations. Whatever the reason, Ghost had evolved from a call sign into something approaching mythology. The change was subtle but unmistakable. When air support was requested, ground commanders began asking specifically for her by name. Other pilots started analyzing her tactics, trying to understand how she'd managed to execute attacks that seemed to violate basic principles of aircraft performance and survival. Flight instructors at training bases began using sanitized versions of her missions as teaching tools, though they were careful to emphasize that such tactics should never be attempted by less experienced pilots. The message was clear. This was virtuoso-level flying that required years of experience and an intuitive understanding of aircraft capabilities that couldn't be taught. Valentina, characteristically, seemed unaware of her growing legend. She